With that being said, please welcome Frank Cumberbatch, Vice President at Bader Philanthropies, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, President Todd. Before I start, let me just please support our fallen soldiers, because when we give up our children to serve this country, we never know if we're going to get them back. So thank you for that. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a guy I call my friend. You're in for a treat. Teig Whaley Smith, sometimes we think, was born for this work that he does. He was raised and continues to live in the Sherman Park neighborhood and is a proud graduate of Milwaukee Public Schools. His passion is building and leading collaborative teams to make Milwaukee the best place on the planet. And it's not an exaggeration. Teig believes that if Milwaukee is to achieve its fullest potential, there needs to be a focus on the people, the neighborhoods that have been left out of the large social, political, and economic systems of this city and this country. And he's earned the right to say that. Teig has served as the chief operating officer for Milwaukee County, where he managed $1.2 billion, serving 1 million residents. He supported the expansion of mental health services, the elimination of chronic homelessness, and was a core member of the leadership team that made Milwaukee the first municipality in this country to declare that racism is a public health crisis. And he helped develop the strategic plan to work on racism. He served as the Economic Development Director for Milwaukee County and led efforts to develop more than $1 billion in the former Park East, and that includes the Fiserv Forum. In 2022, he was named the Chief Alliance Executive for the Community Development Alliance, of which I'm proud to say I'm part of. The CDA is an alliance of community development funders and practitioners focused on advancing racial equity by providing a quality, affordable home for every Milwaukeean. Fellow Rotarians, please welcome my friend, Teig Whaley Smith.
Good afternoon, everyone. You would hear the loud voice over here from Alderman Stamper, who is my alderman, saying good afternoon, because we have a tradition in our neighborhood. When people say good afternoon, you say it back. So I'm going to try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. All right. So great to see all these beautiful faces out here on such a wonderful day. Again, my name is Teig Whaley Smith from the Community Development Alliance. And I'm here today to talk to all of you about the racial equity issue we have in housing in Milwaukee and how we intend to solve it. And these problems have been created over centuries, and we are not going to solve them overnight. But it's important that we do it together to make progress. And why start with housing? So there are hospital representatives in the room, public safety folks, people in the economic development and running your own business and work on employment. And it turns out that housing is deeply attached to all of those other social determinants of health. And we're understanding this more and more through some really recent research. For example, in education, kids that come from families that are in stable housing have a 20 to 30% lower dropout rate. That's huge. If I told you that you could solve the dropout crisis by the tune of 20 to 30% by providing stable housing, that's information we didn't have even 5 years ago. In the areas of crime, this one is just shocking. If you invest in housing, you can have a 20% impact on reducing crime, including homicide rates. This came from the work of Matthew Desmond, that many of you know, wrote the book about Milwaukee's eviction crisis in the book Evicted. This is research from last year that illustrates this point. When it comes to jobs, 20%, notice a theme here, 20% higher employment rates and lower layoff rates, whether people are in full-time jobs or apprenticeship work, if they are coming from stable housing. And then finally, in health. Ultimately, we want quality life for everyone. and it was about an 18%, not quite 20%, we're getting there, benefit on the overall health of families if they have stable housing. So this is why we start with housing. And we all have our housing journey. My housing journey, along with many Americans, starts with my grandfather. My grandfather grew up in Galesville, Wisconsin, and grew up very poor. And there was a point that I really realized this when I bought my first home and I put a rain barrel on my house because I wanted to be a good environmentalist. And I told my grandfather this, and he said, "You mean a cistern?" And I said, "No, Grandpa, it's a rain barrel. You put it on and you collect the water and you water your plants." And he says, "I know what you're talking about. It's called a cistern. We had one in our kitchen, and it collected the rainwater, and that's what we used to wash the dishes and provide water for our house," because he had no running water in his house, as did most families, many families growing up in rural Wisconsin or other places across the country and during the Great Depression. And then my grandfather caught a huge break because in 1950s, we had this incredible system of developers and home builders that were building entry-level homes, massive subsidy in the form of infrastructure that was invested into families. And my grandfather got a VA loan. He was a vet, and he was a VA loan, and he built this house on Warnemont Street in Madison. And I'm still researching to see exactly how much it cost to build and exactly how much he paid for it. But we do know from that time in our history that the average income in the United States was $6,000. And many of these homes, sort of the Levittown homes that were built across the country, were delivered for about $12,000. So think about that. For twice the annual income, the median annual income, we were able to deliver housing. And so this is where my housing journey started, even though it was my grandfather's home. Because, of course, $12,000, that home and the homes around it are now worth over $300,000. So my grandfather didn't stay in this home this entire time, but he upgraded his home. It provided a stable life for his family, and he had a great career working at the UW-Madison. And he loaned my parents the down payment that they needed to buy their home in Milwaukee. So this is the duplex that my parents owned on the northwest side of Milwaukee, and my father lent them the down payment assistance. My grandfather also paid for my undergraduate education, which was phenomenal because, again, this wealth that he built through having a stable family and stable housing. And so I got a great job out of school. I went to law school and got a great job here at a firm called Michael Best and Friedrich that many of you may know. And they had this wonderful benefit. I don't know if they still have this benefit. I'll talk with Brad afterwards, see if they do. But I had no down payment. They guaranteed my down payment. So I bought this amazing home on Grant Boulevard in Sherman Park, my forever home with my wife and 4 kids, and I didn't have a single down payment. I doubt it did at a really good time because real estate prices shot up. Remember that bubble, right? And actually took money out of my house to create equity for a startup. And I started working with nonprofits to do affordable housing in Milwaukee and did about $60 million of development on the north side of Milwaukee based off of the equity that I built in my home. That was based off the equity of my parents' home. It was based off of the equity of my grandfather's home. That was based off of this massive movement across this country to do entry-level housing and get people out of homes that had cisterns in them. And so that's my story and my housing story. But you can imagine that housing story is very different depending on who you are, in the United States and who you are in Milwaukee. So I want to tell you about my friend Ray, because my friend Ray had a very different experience. And so my friend Ray grew up in the Berryland Apartments. So let's just acknowledge how wonderful the Housing Authority of the City of Milwaukee is to provide that safety net for people. But you can imagine that experience is very, very different than growing up in a home ownership aspect. And so at the time that I had no down payment and was building up equity in my home, my friend Ray was spending 50% of their income on rent and unable to save for a down payment. And they were evicted during that 2008 bubble that we talked about because they lost their job and ended up doubling up. So massively different experience. And with all of the great and smart people in this room, the difference between those two stories is that I am white and Ray is black. And this is the story of our country. This is the story of our city. And it's important to tell these stories and the privilege that I have in my housing story. And you may share that privilege, or your story may be more like Ray's. But we need to tell these stories and understand these stories because the data can get kind of lost. But this is connected to not just my story and Ray's story, it's connected to the massive data numbers that we see. Because the reality is 67% of people that look like me are homeowners in Milwaukee, and only about less than 30% of the people that look like Ray are homeowners. And that's what we want to work on together and do things collectively. This is not just an old story about Galesville, Wisconsin, and building a house in Madison. This is a today story. You can see what has happened since that real estate bubble that happened in 2010. In Milwaukee, there was a loss of about 2% white home ownership, and then sort of recovered. And look what happened in communities that are largely Latino and communities that are Black in Milwaukee. We have lost 20% of the homeowners in Black communities in Milwaukee over the last 10 years. This is really devastating. It's largely through a practice that we refer to as predatory acquisition, where people are coming into neighborhoods and buying up properties that were built for homeowners like my grandfather, and instead of selling them to families of color, they are being bought by investors. In fact, we just went through a data review, and 50% of the homes, the single-family homes in Milwaukee that were built for homeowners are now investor-owned in that category of about 100 to 125,000. 50% that were built for homeowners are now owned by investors. So we need to switch this trend, okay? So we need to go from losing 1,000 homeowners of color each year to gaining 1,000 homeowners of color each year. And I told you this is a long-term effort. And so the overall goal, if we want to reach racial equity, is we need to hit 32,000 Black and Latino homeowners. So it's going to take us 30 years to do this, which nobody wants to hear. But again, this is centuries in the making. We went from a time period where Black people were forbidden from owning property to a time period, that time period went all the way through 1968, right? That's when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And you'll see later that the majority of housing that was built before 1968, when it wasn't even legal for people of color to own homes. The other issue that we've discovered during looking at data collection for the Collective Affordable Housing Plan is related to rental. And I'm not going to talk much about rental today, but it's important to understand that this issue also exists. And what this issue is that there are about 75,000 families in Milwaukee that make $15 an hour or less. This is what we have decided as a country is a living wage, right? We're not there, right? I see lots of head shaking no, right? So we can disagree about that number, but let's just say that the number is $15 an hour. There are only 43,000 rental homes that are available to them. So what does that mean? Is that you have, almost 30,000 plus people that are spending more than 30% of their income on rent. In fact, they're spending 70, 80% of their income on rent. How are they ever going to save for a home? How are they ever going to buy a car to get to work, right? So this is the crisis that we've created. So similarly, we need to, in addition to homeowners, or maybe it's the same category, we need systems to make available 1,000 homes per year that are at $650 a month or less. So those are the targets that we're talking about here. The good news is that Ray actually is a homeowner now. This is Ray and their son Elijah, and they were able to buy a home through Axe Housing. If you don't know Axe Housing, phenomenal organization that works with homeowners, potential homeowners to buy tax foreclosed properties and rehab them. And this is her home now here in Milwaukee. And Ray is just fantastic in helping build their community. And so we know how to do this, but we just don't know how to do it at scale yet. So what we need to do is look at how do we take these incredible work that's being done at the neighborhood level and bring it to scale. How do we do that? So we do that through a principle called collective action, which you have likely all heard as a general concept of working together on things. We generally understand that principle. If you haven't worked in this industry, it's actually a science. There's 5 principles to collective action that you see on the screen there. And I just want to highlight 2 because there's been, again, great data to support this, that there was a review of 25 different communities that were working on collective impact. And those communities, there were 5 of them, that there was no other larger societal trend that explained their success but for collective action, right? Like we could all say that, we worked on incomes and incomes went up in the last year. Hooray, right? That is unlikely due to collective action. It's likely to due to bigger socioeconomic trends. But in these 5 communities, these communities did 2 things that the data scientists said were the only reason to explain why there was a movement in what they were doing. And that was they created a backbone support organization. That's what the Community Development Alliance strives to do in housing. Several of you are familiar with the Milwaukee Healthcare Partnership and all the hospitals getting together. We strive to be like them in the housing industry. And the second thing to do is to create a common agenda. And so that's what we've done in the last year, is created the Collective Affordable Housing Plan with a whole host of stakeholders to try to tackle this problem. And then what that coalition needs to do is they need to focus on data, resources, policies, and systems. Many of you are familiar with the difference between transactional work and transformational work. Transactional work is helping people navigate existing systems, and we have lots of great projects that are doing that in Milwaukee, but those projects have difficulty getting to scale because the systems aren't there yet to support them. And so we need to collectively work on these larger systems. So here's how we do that. Here's what collective action looked like. We are a big tent, and there is room for a lot of partners in working on this. And those words are not mine. Those are the words of Gina from the Zilber Family Foundation, who is our chair, who has been a phenomenal leader in this, together with the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, Northwestern Mutual, Audra, Steve, and LaQuandra are here from the coalition, the MGIC, of course, Bader Foundation, and Frank. The city of Milwaukee has been phenomenal through leaders like Alderman Stamper, who I first got to know working on the board of the Sherman Park Community Association and has been working on homeownership his entire career. Milwaukee County and Jim Matthey, who is a leader in working on homelessness issues and otherwise. The Housing Authority, an incredible Secretary Willie Hines, WEDA, GMC, the Healthcare Partnership, List Milwaukee, and we want to maintain resident voice throughout this. So in addition to reviewing resident plans, we also brought to the table resident liaisons from both Metcalf Park, Community Bridges, and the Southside Organizing Center. And so this is what collective action starts to look at, but it has to be a bigger, broader movement, and we're constantly looking for additional partners. And so I'll come back to this at the end, but what does that mean for everybody in this room? So if you're interested in getting involved, the first thing to do is just plug in. So if you go to housingplan.org, I feel like the YouTubers that my kids watch. Hit that subscribe button and get on our email list, and so you know what's happening. For example, there was a big advocacy push on a really nerdy concept that nobody ever provides public comment to, and we got like 25 people to submit public comment. That's going to matter, and so those are the kind of opportunities to be aware of through that. If you have an idea, you guys are successful in all of your endeavors. That's what brought you to this point. We want to know what you think about these issues. Drop us an email at ideas@housingplan.org. And most importantly, get going. Collective action is not about us as an organization being a bureaucracy and telling everybody what to do. It's a way to share ideas and focus momentum in one direction. So in that housing plan, it's important to know where we started, because we have been doing community planning in our communities for decades. And these plans don't get a lot of momentum because, again, there are no systems to support them. And so you have these incredible victories that happen in these neighborhoods, which are just fantastic. But similar to the way Ray is now a homeowner, we need to take those ideas and build systems around them to elevate them. So we reviewed about 25 plans, resident-based plans, and other groups to look at what are residents saying about housing. And it is overwhelming. It's almost the same verbiage in every one of these reports. Home ownership is an important strategy to both stabilize our neighborhood and build wealth. You can find that in every single neighborhood plan, whether it's far south side, far north side, right in the middle. We need to elevate home ownership. The second is, given the average median earnings of $21,000 for working residents in our neighborhood, the average rent of $900 is extremely high. No kidding, right? I mean, this is where money is going. Instead of going into investing in a homeowner, it's being taken out of our neighborhoods. So I won't give you all the details of all the housing plans that are in there, but I just want to give you a sense of some of the things that are in there. So for example, the best way to grow homebuyer and down payment the best way to grow homeowners is to do down payment assistance and homebuyer counseling. The city of Milwaukee, again, through leadership of the city council and the mayor and others and DCD, Commissioner Crump as part of the coalition as well, is they did a pilot program with their ARPA funding. This is the federal money that came to cities. And they allocated $1 million for down payment assistance, and it was gone in 6 months. Turns out there's this massive group of Black Latino families that have been waiting to buy a home, but they just couldn't do it because they needed some assistance. So with $6,000 to $10,000 of down payment assistance, these families are now homeowners, served 160 homeowners in 6 months, completely unheard of. Another strategy, we need an acquisition fund to compete with the predatory buyers that are in our neighborhoods. Not to get too much into the details, but people are buying up portfolios. Silicon Valley folks with high data processing and targeting and algorithms are buying up properties like we've never seen before. Some of this has been covered by John Johnson and Mike Boucher in the Journal Sentinel. We want to raise about $11 million to compete and say, instead of selling your properties to these outside investors, sell them to us at the same price. We'll split up those portfolios and get them back into the hands of homeowners. There are, of course, also rental strategies, and I don't want to get too deep into them today, but just know that they're there. All of this information is available at housingplan.org. I want to talk about home ownership with this crowd because my guess is that the home ownership rate in this room is really high, which is a good thing, and we understand the value of being a homeowner. And so this is what our current home ownership looks like in the city of Milwaukee. Is you have 55.8% white home ownership, 37.5% Latino, and 25% Black. What you should know about these numbers is that number for Black families is second worst in the nation. So we are not keeping up with our peer cities from a competitive basis. You should also know that this is an all-time low. Recall that the Fair Housing Act happened in 1968. So previous to that, there were deed restrictions that were actually enforceable that said you couldn't sell your home to a Black person. So we really started measuring Black home ownership after 1968. And it turns out in the 1970s, there were actually support systems, and Black home ownership in Milwaukee was at an all-time high of about 37%. And of course, now it's going down to 27%. So we are losing ground. So let's talk about how we regain that ground. Okay, and let's talk a little bit about the history of this again. So you remember this house on Warnemont Street that I mentioned, about 1,000 square foot home. This is what single family home construction looked like in the city of Milwaukee. So look at that for a moment. And, in the 1800s, the entire century, we had about 5,000 units that were built. And then in the 1900s, over that decade, another 5,000. And look what happened in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. You look at this, and 90% of our single-family homes that were built in the city were built prior to, you guessed it, 1968 and the Fair Housing Act. And so this is a root cause of this problem that we don't talk about enough, is that when we did this major push of building single-family homes, Black and Latino families and families of color were excluded from owning them. And then all of a sudden we have federal legislation that says you can no longer exclude them, and we stopped building it. Now, are those two things exactly related? I don't know. You could make a case for that, but you can also make a case that this is the time that cities were growing. Why were they growing? Because we were supporting single-family entry-level homes. So this is also the time period that the city of Milwaukee stopped growing. We stopped doing acquisition, and there weren't a lot of room to build. And then we only started building things in the suburbs. And we all know, for the most part, what the suburbs did, they required you to build really big houses, right? And so we have never built single-family homes at an entry level for Black and Latino families. In fact, we know this. We knew this all the way back in 1976, okay? And I want to read this out here because I don't want to get this wrong. I took the liberty of adding the word white because I think they forgot it. So let me read this, all right? The recent significant increase in new housing prices can be attributed in part to the changing nature of the white new home buyer, who is more affluent than the white home buyer of the 50s and 60s. White buyers of today's new houses are generally white families in the upper or upper middle income brackets with two incomes who can afford both the down payment and the monthly homeownership costs. Or prior white homeowners who are able to use the equity from their existing homes to buy the higher priced new homes. And then this last line really grabs me. because it says in the 1950s and 60s, most new home buyers were white families with one income buying their first home. Does this sound familiar? I mean, this could be written right now, right? We have understood this issue for almost 50 years, that we lost the ability as a country to build entry-level housing because we moved on. White families had their homes. They had the 70, 80% home ownership. And so now the entire ecosystem of the houses that got built, the houses that got bought, the houses that suburbs and other communities would allow were now based on dual income families that had built up equity in their first home. And we literally stopped building entry-level homes. In 1950, the average square foot home was 1,000 square feet. In today's dollars, would have cost about $109,000 to build. Okay, now we cannot build it for $109,000 anymore, right? There are other things that have changed. Okay, but compared to 1976, 25 years later, the average house built in the United States, 1,700 square feet and a price of $156,000. So we started building homes twice the size than before. Average household or average house in Milwaukee that is less than $150,000 is 1,000 square feet, right? It's no surprise because we built so many of them during this time period. After 1975, it got a whole lot worse. So after 1975, this is the average square foot home in the United States. So you can see that it started at that 1,700 and has gone well over 2,500, right? This is why Black and Latino families cannot afford a home. Nobody's building them, and the existing inventory, 50% of it is being sold to investors. So I've been talking a lot about affordable housing. So what is affordable housing and what does it mean and how do we tackle this issue? So our definition is that affordable housing is when a home is available for 30% of a family's income. For families like early childhood educators, that's about $650 a month in housing expenses. So with good policy, we really can make a quality, affordable home for everyone. Here are some general income categories and careers when we talk about this issue. One is that this childhood educator making $12 an hour, we feel can afford rent of about $650 per month or a $45,000 home, right? That's going to be really hard to do, but that's the reality of what we're dealing with. That next income category, so teachers, firefighters, postal carriers. So a teacher making $24 an hour can afford a rental home for about $1,250 a month or a $100,000 home. And then you get to the professors, the architects, people that are making $80,000 a year. They can afford $2,500 a month in rent, which would be really high, which is why they don't rent. And instead, the average home that they can afford is about $240,000. So generally, when we're talking about affordable housing, we feel it's important to identify which income categories we're talking about. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, which will go unnamed. Hopefully none of you were there, where there was an executive on stage that said sometimes the workforce housing problem is a problem of CEO housing. And my jaw almost hit the floor and I had to pick it back up, right? Because that's not the problem, right? When we look from a racial equity perspective and we look at what people are actually making, when we talk about workforce housing, we need to be talking to people to the middle, to the left of that chart, okay? And here's why, is that if you look in Black and Latino families right now, there are about 26,000 Black and Latino families that are making between $12 and $24 an hour that aren't already homeowners, okay? And as you might expect, as income goes up, the home ownership rate goes up. So it would be much easier to focus on a $150,000, $200,000 home. Turns out Black and Latino families that can afford that price of home, they already have home ownership rates that are similar to white families. And so what we really need to be focused on is that 26,000 number of how do we get that group to be homeowners and how do we get that group of teachers making $24 to $40 an hour to be homeowners as well. Because remember that number of 32,000, that's what it's going to take to hit racial equity. If we're serious about getting the home ownership rate of Black and Latino families to 67, 68% like it is for white families, we need to be addressing those families. And what can those families afford? $100,000 home or less. And so that's where that is really critical to hit that. So right now, what does that number mean, right? So that total number, that total pie was, like 34,000 families, but not everybody wants to be a homeowner. So if we just make an assumption that Black and Latino families want to be homeowners at the same rate of white homeowners, that means there's about 17,000 Black and Latino families in Milwaukee that are aspiring to buy a $100,000 home. So 17,000, and there are less than 1,000 that are available each year. They're over 75 years old, and they're largely purchased by investors. And this is only going to get worse. The investors are picking up, and the houses are only getting older, right? Which makes it more and more difficult for families to maintain. So part of the answer, not the only answer to all of this, part of the answer is we need to build at scale entry-level homes for Black and Latino families. And that is going to involve a shift to building homes that are the average house that we built in the 1950s that built white wealth. Because now the prices are much, much higher. There are differences that now exist that didn't exist before. And so now it costs us to build a 1,000 square foot home about $187,000. So we need essentially $80,000 of subsidy to make that transaction a reality. If you increase that house by just 250 square feet, doesn't sound like a lot, 250 square feet, but you are adding $40,000 of cost to that transaction, raising the level of subsidies that's needed to $120,000. So if you go back to, again, this home, which is part of my story and maybe your story too, we really need to change that trend. And from now going forward, we really need to focus collectively on an affordable housing plan that's going to increase that number of housing that's built in Milwaukee. Great news is that we have over 4,000 vacant lots in the city of Milwaukee to start doing this. This is an asset that most communities don't have. And we got to stop looking at it like a liability. These lots already have hookups for utilities, street service, alley service. They're part of the fabric of a neighborhood that we lost. And so we have a credible opportunity. We also have an incredible opportunity with the ARPA funds that have been allocated across the state and otherwise. We talked about the city of Milwaukee's allocation of ARPA funds towards down payment assistance. The state also allocated to Milwaukee County about $6 million to start building entry-level homes. But again, that can't be the only strategy. At best, we're going to be able to build about 200 units if we exceed our wildest dreams to build 200 units per year. By working collectively, we have to implement other strategies. Don't have time to tell you about all those strategies, but that's what we're working on, and hope you will be part of the coalition. What's next for us? We've set up resident focus groups with Wisconsin Voices and the Southside Organizing Center, both of which have partnered with several smaller neighborhood groups to talk with residents about what they need to match that to the financial capacity. We've set up implementation teams. Again, if you're on our stakeholder email list, you'll get notice about that. We need your opinions on how to do this. And setting up project-based community meetings with folks like Alderman Stamper who represent these areas to make sure that these are consistent with all those incredible quality of life plans. So happy to take questions. I think we got about 10 minutes. I want to leave this on the screen because, again, please plug in, even if it's just getting an email from us every month so you know what's going on. So if you see you want to step up, and if you have an idea for us, please share that as well. And we'll certainly make this presentation available to share through your network. Thank you very much. I think they want you to come to the mic for questions. Is that how this is working?
How you doing? Thanks for that awesome presentation, Brent F. Lawson. I'm looking for some information on if all the lower price houses are displaced, you're not going to find a lot of new homeowners, even if you build scratch new for 1,000 square feet, $187,000. So is the city considering ordinance or even allowed to do ordinance or even at the state level to do something about the investment purchases of that $40,000 to $100,000 housing stock to slow that down? Because I think ultimately those homeowners moving into maybe a $180,000 house now opens up another more affordable house that can keep the pipeline going.
Yes, the answer is the city of Milwaukee did do something about that, and the state of Wisconsin preempted it. And so this is where all of you can be helpful in advocating for these issues. And so to about, I don't know, 5 years ago, the city council passed a new rule that if you were to buy property and turn it into rental, that you had to bring it up to code compliance, within a certain time period. And then the state legislature came in and said, you can no longer do that, right? And so also the city of Milwaukee passed what's called inclusive zoning. So remember when I said that suburban communities had zoned things to require really big properties? We now refer that to as exclusionary zoning. You're excluding people that can't, build that big of a house. The city of Milwaukee actually passed inclusionary zoning to say you have to be inclusive things. And what happened? You notice a pattern here? The state of Wisconsin preempted it. So that's why collective action is really important, because this impacts everybody in this room. The homeownership rate in Milwaukee has gone down over 10% in the last decade, and it's not happening in white neighborhoods. And so if we want to keep the homeownership rate up, which benefits everybody and your businesses in this room, we need to change that. So the answer is yes, the city of Milwaukee continues to work on that, trying to thread that needle, but a lot of this is governed by the state, and the state keeps knocking them down.
In listening to your presentation, I get the sense that it's the investors who are changing this situation. And that what's the investor's model? It seems to me for it to work, you have to raise the rates and run down the property values.
Yeah, so there's actually some, if you guys don't follow Matthew Desmond, the guy who wrote Evicted, he's incredible and really a benefit that he's focusing on Milwaukee. His data supports exactly what you're saying. That the issue is that investors are coming up and buying up properties, paying very low rates for the property, very low purchase price for the property is what I want to say. And then they make this claim that they have to dump massive amounts of resources into the property to fix it up to be renting it out. I love the heads that are shaking no in this room, right? Because it's all the people that work in the neighborhoods and know that this is not happening, right? The investors that are doing this are doing exactly what you mentioned, which is buying properties, not putting money, letting the rent drain out of it, and eventually it becomes an abandoned property that the city needs to take care of. There is a slightly different model, and anyway, that Matthew Desmond study verifies that's exactly what's happening. There's a slight variation to that model that we all should be concerned about, which is some of these Silicon Valley firms, I'll lump them together generally. It seems what they are doing are actually, investing in the property. And the way they do it is they kick out the existing tenant. They have their crew come in and do the exact same thing to every unit to be efficient about it. And then they jack the rent way up. And so we really have two problems and two models of investors where that's happening. And it's not that hard to disrupt this because, again, there are only about 1,000 units each year that transfer hands in Milwaukee that are less than $100,000 each. So we just need to disrupt that 1,000 to 1,500 properties and make sure homeowners are winning that battle. Our goal is to raise $11 million in order to do that. Part of that is going to come from the public. Part of that's got to come from the private sector, and it can't happen soon enough. Again, this is where your advocacy can help to support folks like Alderman Stamper and others that are, supportive of this issue and competing with other interests for them to get their email box and other email boxes to say, hey, this acquisition fund is a great idea, is a role that you can all play. You built up the suspense there. That was great.
That'd be a good question. You work with Habitat for Humanity, and if so, what kind of impact can they make on these affordable houses?
Great question, and thank you for bringing them up. So I mentioned Axe Housing, there's Habitat, there's the United Community Center, there's Housing Resources, Inc., there's the Dominican Sisters and the work that they do in Amani, together with all the foundations. So the answer is absolutely yes. So our coalition is funders and practitioners and advocates working together. The Habitat model is really phenomenal. Most of you are familiar with it in general, but they bring in the volunteer labor, which is very helpful because that's about $20,000 of value in each unit. I remember I said he needed about $80,000. that brings that subsidy down to about $60,000, which is very, very helpful in the grand scheme of things. So we really need a plan to double their capacity, and Brian, the executive director there, has been fantastic. Some of you know about the Mackenzie Scott gift that they just got, and so that's all going to be very helpful. Even if they double their capacity, that's probably the extent that they can go, because they depend on that volunteer labor, and eventually there's not enough people, which you can also help with, sponsor a home at Habitat. So absolutely phenomenal organization, together with a lot of practitioners. And remember that pie chart that I showed you? Those are exactly the families that Axe Housing, Habitat, SDC, HRI, they're all serving. These families want to be homeowners. We just need to get them there.
Congratulations on a great report. And in fact, you're working with Habitat, which gets at some of the job skills perhaps so that young people can benefit from as they build the houses. Question is, Evicted, the book, has put the spotlight on Milwaukee. There'll be another spotlight, arguably, that will come in 2024. What are your thoughts on a path towards 2024 and a collective action approach that would show the world, if you will, if we get the RNC, that we made a difference in response to Evicted, the book?
Oh, what a great question. Boy, I didn't practice that one in the notes. So the way that I'll answer that is to say, remember my grandfather's house, and maybe somewhere in your ancestral history, the houses that were built. That was federal policy, and it was federal policy that was responsive to a massive amount, but not all, of American families' needs. And I think that's a really powerful argument to say we know how to do this. We know how to build wealth in this country, because we did it for white families in the 1940s through the 1960s, and we can do it again, and we can do it better. And we can only do that through joint participation. I would also answer that by saying, remember, I didn't talk much about rental, but it turns out that rental mismatch that I showed you in Milwaukee County, that's a statewide issue. There's something like 200,000 families in the state of Wisconsin that are making less than $15 an hour, and only like 110,000 units that are available to them. So there's 90,000 families in the state of Wisconsin. And so I think there's incredible opportunity for bipartisanship here. But I will also say that we need to have a serious conversation about local control. That has to be a part of the conversation, because you have very progressive people locally that are trying to get things done and address this issue through sound policy, and it keeps getting knocked down at the state level. That can't continue, and it spreads through something else that I know you guys have talked about here when it comes to the way that municipalities are funded, through a sales tax or otherwise. There's really smart best practice policy that wants to be implemented locally, but there's a disconnect between us and the rest of the state. I'm a big fan of Adam Grant, and if you know his work, and Think Again and otherwise, and he says if you want to influence people, start with what we have in common. And what we have in common is housing, and the impact housing has on our own families, our community health, and otherwise. So I would encourage everybody to lead with that foot, whether it's the DNC or the RNC or otherwise. What are we doing about housing? Because it's really connected to all of our lives. I will certainly hang around. Thank you all very much for your time. I appreciate it.